You think only these decide your faith in McKinsey hiring process? It doesn't. In 2026, by the time you speak to a partner, if you even get there, your file already exists. Scores, percentiles, and now transcript of how you think with AI. In early 2026, McKinsey began testing something new. Candidates solving cases with an AI assistant. Not as a tool, but as part of the evaluation itself. So the question is no longer just, can you solve the case? It's, how do you think when intelligence is no longer just your own? In this video, I'll walk you through how McKinsey's hiring process actually works in 2026 and probably beyond. We're going to look at how McKinsey's hiring system has really worked behind the scene, why that system is now being quietly rewritten with AI, and what does that mean for you, and ultimately, who or what actually decide your fate in this process. And if we haven't met before, this is Ramin. I work with high achievers looking to break into roles in consulting, finance, and corporate strategic roles. Most people describe McKinsey hiring like a checklist. Resume, solve game, case interview, final round. Technically correct, but completely misleading. And just so you have a sense of how sensitive this hiring process at McKinsey is, roughly speaking, fewer than 1 in 100 applicants end up getting an offer. And a large majority never even reach the interview stage. Not because they're not smart, but because the system is designed to be very specific. And there is a reason for that. If you go back a couple of decades, hiring in consulting was much more personal. Partners would meet candidates, trust their instinct, lean heavily on certain universities or referrals, and that worked when firms were smaller. But as McKinsey grew globally, that approach stopped working. Too many candidates, too many offices, too many inconsistencies. So they did what they're really good at. They built a system, something more structured, more comparable, more predictable. And over time, that system became very refined. So instead of asking who is the best person, the process is really asking who fits this very specific way of thinking and operating. Now, let me walk you through each stage, not just what it is, but how to think about it. Resume screening is the first step, and it's quieter than people expect. No one is sitting there deeply reading your story from start to finish. At this stage, there are also internal systems, similar to what people call ATS, that help sort and prioritize application across thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of candidates applying to different offices at McKinsey. So before a human really spent time on your profile, it's already been organized, filtered, and in some cases, ranked. But beyond that, what they're looking for is patterns. Have you consistently performed well? Have you taken initiative somewhere? Or is there evidence that you've created impact, even in small ways? It's less about perfection and more about whether your trajectory makes sense. So all in all, this very first step means something quite important. Clarity matters more than you think. Because if your experience isn't immediately legible, it can get lost very early. And just to share this from experience, because I've worked with tens of people trying to get into firms like McKinsey. Having a strong CV is important, don't get me wrong, but often that alone isn't enough. What actually makes it different in many cases is how you position yourself around it. For example, building a system where you create the right referrals before you even submit your application. So your profile is seen in the right context from the beginning. But coming back to the process, once your profile passes this stage, everything becomes a bit more objective. This is where the processes start to feel different, because here you're no longer explaining yourself, you're interacting with a system. McKinsey's Solve assessment is not a typical test. It's built as a series of interactive games. Some of the more well-known seen by many candidates I worked with are Ecosystem or the Reef game, where you are managing a natural environment, balancing species, resources, and long-term stability. Plan Defense or Resource Allocation scenarios, where you decide how to protect or grow something under constraint. Each of these looks simple on the surface, but underneath, they're testing something very specific. What you're actually being evaluated on is how you structure a problem when there is no clear framework. how you make decisions with incomplete information, and how consistent your thinking is over time. And what makes this stage unique is this. There is no performance layer, no way to explain yourself out of a mistake. It's just your decision, one after another. And they track everything from your mouse movement, number of clicks, or how you use your keyboard. The solve game of McKinsey quietly building a picture of how you think. And because of that, this becomes one of the strongest filters in the entire process. A lot of candidates don't make it past this stage. Not because they're not smart, but because their thinking isn't structured yet in a way that system can recognize. Now, at the same time, and this is important to understand, this stage is no longer a mystery. There are preparation platforms, simulation, breakdown of each gate. You can train for it. And if you prepare well, you can absolutely get very good at it. I've broken down the exact materials and approach I use with people I work with. If you want it, comment solve and I'll send it over. So yes, this is a stage you'll need to take seriously and prepare for. Because if you don't pass it, it simply won't move forward. In my view, this might change very fast in future because what firms like McKinsey are realizing is if someone practices enough, they can learn how to perform well in this type of environment, which is exactly why the process doesn't stop here. This is the part everyone focuses on. And understandably, it's the most visible. You're giving a business problem and you work through it with the interviewer.
Let me give you an overview of the client and the problem before we get started. With this one, our client is a company called Flash Fash.
Okay.
They're a US multinational apparel company.
But if you have never done one before, it helps to reframe what this actually is. It's not a test of knowledge. It's a test of how you approach something you've never seen before. Can you bring a structure into something messy? Can you stay composed when you don't immediately know the answer? And can you communicate your thinking clearly, even while it's still forming? And at McKinsey specifically, the format is often interviewer-led, which means the interviewer is actively guiding the conversation. They might interrupt you, they might redirect you, and they might stop you if you are going down the wrong path. And that's not a negative signal. That's part of the design because what they're really observing is this. How do you respond when your thinking is challenged in real time? Do you adapt? Do you get defensive? Do you lose structure or refine it? This part of the process is not a secret. There are countless materials out there, books, courses, platforms. You can absolutely prepare for this. But here is where I think it's important to be honest. Most of that preparation happens in a very controlled environment. You're practicing clean cases, clear problems, structured answers. Real consulting work doesn't look like that. I can tell you from experience. So the real goal here is not just to do more cases, it's to understand what the case is trying to simulate, which is how a strategy consultant thinks through a problem when there isn't clear path. And this is something I emphasize quite a bit with people I've worked with. The difference is rarely just the number of cases you have practiced. It's whether you have internalized how to structure ambiguity, how to prioritize under pressure, and how to communicate incomplete thinking clearly. Because in the end, the case interview is not just about solving that problem. It's about showing how you would approach any problem.
Can you tell me a time when you had to rapidly learn something new to tackle a challenging situation?
This part tends to surprise a lot of candidates because it's very different from the case. Typically, during your interview rounds, you usually have 2 or 3 interviews with different consultants or partners. This part will either come at the end or towards the end of each interview, and it's quite structured. They ask you to walk through a specific experience, something that didn't go as planned, a situation where you had to influence others, and then they'll go deep. Not just what happened, but what exactly did you do? What were you thinking at that moment? Why did you choose that approach? And what changed because of you? And they won't move on quickly. They'll stay in that one story, sometimes for 10 to 15 minutes. Because what they're really trying to understand is not the story itself, it's you inside that story. Can you take ownership? Can you handle conflict? Can you influence others when it's not easy? You can think of it as a way for them to assess the traits they expect in a consultant: leadership, drive, resilience, personal impact. Now, the important thing to understand is this part is also something you can prepare for. Most strong candidates come in with a few well thought through stories, and typically we structure them in a way that's clear and easy to follow. For example, using something like the STAR framework: situation, task, action, result. But it's not about memorizing a script, and they'll push deeper. So the real preparation here is twofold. First, structuring your stories clearly. And second, developing enough what I call self-awareness to explain why you acted the way you did. And this is something I spend quite a bit of time on with people I work with, helping them understand what their story actually says about them. Because in the end, this part is less about what you have done and more about whether they can trust you to operate in situations where things are messy, ambiguous, and sometimes high pressure. And then you reach the final round. This is usually the stage people fear the most, not only because you are speaking with a partner or two, depending on the office, but because the tone of interview often changes. It becomes a bit more nuanced, a bit more layered, and in many cases, a bit less predictable. In earlier rounds, especially with consultant or engagement managers, the evaluation can feel more structured and by the book. You solve the case, you answer the PEI questions, they'll score you on fairly defined dimensions. But with partners, the conversation often becomes broader. They still care about whether you can solve a problem. You may still get another business case, and often you will. But this time, they'll usually look at the whole picture. Can you think clearly under pressure? Do you actually have a consultant's way of approaching a messy problem? Can you structure well, communicate well, and stay composed while doing it? Can you handle a senior person pushing back on your thinking? And do you look like someone who could work with clients, with teams, with long hours, with ambiguity? That's why this stage feels different. It's less like a test with clean boundaries and more like a live attempt to understand what would it actually feel like to work with you. And that's also why this round can go in different directions. Sometimes it'll stay very case heavy, sometimes it becomes more conversational, sometimes the partner will push deeply on your logic, other times they might spend more time understanding your motivation, your career trajectory, or how you think about growth. So it feels more fluid, more dynamic, and often a bit more personal. Now, the good news is this: if you genuinely understand what the consulting role is in reality, not just how to perform in an interview, but what the job actually demands, this round becomes much easier to navigate. Because then you're not trying to act like a consultant. You're simply demonstrating that you understand how to think, communicate, and operate in the way the role requires. In my experience, one of the biggest reasons candidates struggle here is not necessarily lack of intelligence. It's tension. They become more stressed because they're speaking with someone senior, and that stress often comes from not having enough exposure to how consulting environments actually feel. If you haven't worked around senior stakeholders, if you haven't been challenged live on your thinking, if you haven't had to hold your structure while someone interrupts you, then this round can feel heavier than it actually is. So the real preparation here is not only more case practice, it's also understanding the environment you're stepping into, how consultants actually solve problems, how senior people challenge ideas, how to stay steady when the conversation becomes less scripted. They're asking, can I trust this person in a real client setting? And once you understand that, the final round starts to make a lot more sense. So when you look at the whole hiring process of McKinsey together, it's not just a series of stages. It's a system that gradually builds confidence or removes it until only a small group of candidates remains. And for a long time, this system worked very well. especially for candidates who had already spent time preparing for this kind of process, often coming from an environment where these interviews are taken seriously, where case prep is structured, and where there is a clear understanding of what firms like McKinsey are looking for. In many cases, that includes candidates from so-called feeder university or programs that have over time become strong pipelines into these firms, not just because of the brand name itself, but because the preparation, exposure, and expectations are already built into that environment. Which means those candidates are not just strong on paper, they're also well aligned with the system before they even enter it. But now, in 2026 and beyond, something is starting to change, and it's changing the nature of that funnel, making it broader in some ways and less reliant on some of the signal we just talked about. Because what firms are now looking for is a slightly different. I call it hybrid talent. And this is where things get really interesting.
You framed it as you're a graduate and how do you get into the workforce and is it getting tougher? And we did a little bit of work that said, what kind of skills are folks going to need in an AI-infused world? Right, from an employer's point of view, less the startup, but you're more an at-scale enterprise. What can the models not do?
Traditionally, consulting followed a pyramid structure, a large base of very smart analysts, supporting a number of managers and partners above. But that structure is evolving more into something closer to a diamond, less reliant on a large base of purely analytical profile, and more focused on people who are analytically strong, but also great with people, and increasingly able to work with and orchestrate AI systems. And because of that shift, McKinsey is starting to adjust how it evaluates candidates. Before, McKinsey could only see what you said. Now, they can start to see how you think. In some cases, candidates are now asked to work through problems with an AI assistant. At the first glance, it might sound like, okay, maybe this makes things easier. But that's not really what's happening. What's actually happening is the evaluation becomes much more detailed. Think about it from your perspective. When you're interacting with AI, you're constantly making small decisions. How do I ask this question? Do I trust this answer? And should I go deeper here? Or maybe, is this actually the right direction? And all of that becomes visible to the firm. So instead of just seeing your final answer, they can now see the path you took to get there. And the reason this shift is actually happening is actually quite practical. Over the past few years, candidates have become very good at preparing. There are courses, platforms, frameworks, almost everything can be trained. And if you spend enough time on it, you can get very good at performing inside the interview. But the job itself doesn't exactly look like the interview, especially nowadays. In reality, you're dealing with unclear problems, incomplete information, multiple directions, and now, increasingly, AI as part of your workflow. So what McKinsey is trying to understand is this. If we put you into that environment tomorrow, how do you actually behave? Do you think independently? Do you challenge what you're given? Do you go deep, or do you stay on the surface? And this is the subtle shift. It's no longer about how you perform in isolation. It's about how you perform in interaction. And if you're currently thinking about going through this process, especially in the coming months, as these changes start to become more real, it's worth taking a step back and being intentional about how you approach it. Because the strategy that worked even a year ago might not be enough anymore. If you want to think through this more concretely, based on your own background, your timeline, and the roles you're targeting, you can book a one-on-one career strategy session with me. We'll look at your situation and build a career roadmap for how to approach McKinsey and similar firms in this evolving landscape. I've left the details below if that's useful for you. So if we take a step back, we have now seen two things. There is a system carefully designed over time with multiple stages and filters, and now the system is becoming more observant, more capable of seeing how you actually think, especially with AI entering the process, which naturally brings us to a deeper question. When you go through this hiring process, who is actually deciding your fate? Most people have a simple answer in their mind. They think it's the partner. If I get to the final round and perform well in that final conversation, I'll get the offer. And I understand why it feels that way, because that's the most visible moment. But the reality is a bit more layered than that. Long before you meet anyone, decisions are already being made. Your resume is a screen, your self-performance is evaluated, and at this stage, there is no conversation, no opportunity to explain yourself. It's just, does this profile match what the system is looking for? A lot of strong candidates don't make it past this point, not because they're not capable, but because their signal doesn't quite align. Then you move into interviews, and here it might feel more human. You're talking to someone, you're explaining your thinking, you're building some connection. But behind that interaction, there is still structure. Each interview is assessing you across a specific dimension. How you think, how you communicate, how you handle uncertainty, and importantly, they're not just forming an impression, they're creating inputs that will later be compared. And this is the part most people never see. After your interviews are done, there is a discussion. Interviewers come together, they compare candidates, they challenge each other's view. They ask questions like, would you feel comfortable staffing this person on a real project? Is there anything we're unsure about? And in that moment, your performance becomes relative. Not just, was this good, but how does this compare to other we have seen? Which means something important. Even if you did well, your outcome still depends on context, on consistency, on how clearly your strengths came through across different interviews. And now, with AI entering the process, there is one more layer starting to form. Not fully visible yet, but definitely emerging. Because now there are more signals, more data points, more ways to observe how you think. Earlier, they saw what you said, how you structure a case. Now they can start to see patterns, how you approach problems over time, how you interact with the tools, and how you make decisions when things are unclear. And this is where the system becomes a bit different, not in a negative way, but in a more precise way. Because when something becomes measurable at scale, it becomes optimizable. And naturally, the system starts to favor candidates who are clear in their thinking, consistent in their approach, easy to understand and evaluate. Not necessarily because those are the only valuable traits, but because those are the ones the system can reliably detect. And if you're thinking about going through this process yourself, this is where things become quite practical. Over the coming months, I'll be working more closely with a small group of candidates as part of my summer 2026 consulting cohort, where we go deeper into this process. Not just how to prepare for it, but how to position yourself in a way that actually aligns with how these firms evaluate candidates today. It's a more hands-on, longer-term format, typically over a few months, and of course, money back guaranteed if you did not land an offer, and I'm quite selective with who I work with there. So if you're serious about this path and you want to explore whether it makes sense for you, you can sign up for a short cohort intro call below.